I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. There are some new faces and there are some regular folks, and we're glad to see all of you. And our goal, and let me just offer just a few words before I introduce my excellent colleagues, Jeffrey Lewis and Flint Leverett, to discuss really the staggering and important revelations in the National Intelligence Estimate on Iran that was released on the Directorate of National Intelligence webpage. I mean, to think about this is the fact that it was on Mike McConnell's webpage, proudly, in fact, with even a PR effort attached, is remarkable. I was with the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel and Chaim Ramon and the former Deputy Defense Minister of Israel, Ephraim Snee, when this report was issued 2 nights ago. And I asked the former General Snee what he thought, and he did not know. He assumed this was a leak. And Ephraim said that this is duplicitous and obviously a lot of lies, because we Israelis and the American intelligence community think the same thing on Iran. And he said this in front of a room, so I'm not saying anything that's off record. It was on the record comment. And said this is now a clear signal that the United States is going to forfeit its responsibilities with Iran, and that he needs to quickly return to Israel to convene the intelligence establishment and prepare the Israeli option. Now, while I share this with you, and it's completely consistent with what Ehud Barak said yesterday, Israel's current defense minister, I will share with you that Chaim Ramon, the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, a person who I think is much, much closer to Ehud Olmert, does not share at all Ephraim Snee's prognostication. So I want to be careful that there are, in fact, different factions within the Israeli establishment that see this report and want to do about it differently. So I wanted to put that on the table because it's sort of a fresh, and it was a real-time interaction that we had in New York. My colleagues will have a lot to say about this, but let me just add a couple of key points to talk about my 2 colleagues and why they're so important, and weave parts of this story. First of all, Jeffrey Lewis, in 2005, in his prominent blog, armscontrolwonk.com, profiled his own view that Iran may have shut down its covert weapons program because of a reorganization of its nuclear bureaucracy, its national security bureaucracy, and its interactions with both Europe and the IAEA at that time. And he says that reorganization might have had to snip off those channels. It's a very important piece to read. I've linked it on my blog, The Washington Note. It's very important to go take a look at it because it was not only prescient, but it read the real-time thinking in a strategic sense of what Iran might have been doing. And I think it's important. And a colleague of his, Paul Kerr, also came to the same conclusions in a piece written in 2006. And it's very important to take a look at that because it raises questions, particularly about the President's view that even though our own read and assessment of Iran has been wrong for now many years, but the policy ought not to change, really raises some fundamental questions that I think Flint Leverett will get into. But there's another piece of this story that hasn't been out there, and I just want to credit it for a moment. There is a chapter in a book that maybe some of you read that had to do, that won the Pulitzer in part because of reporting on the wireless wiretap story, and that was Jim Risen's book. Jim Risen of the New York Times wrote a book called State of War. It got a lot of attention because of Jim outing the government's wiretapping activities. What it didn't get attention for are 2 remarkable chapters on Iran. And I recommend all of you to go back and take a look at those chapters on Iran. One tells the story of American bungling with a Russian defector who was attempting to give to the Iranian delegation in Vienna at the IAEA some flawed plans in a nuclear warhead trigger device that would have taken Iran ostensibly down a wrong and costly path. It's a very interesting story. But the more important chapter was a chapter which people have, in the intelligence establishment, have basically told me that rings true. But it's a shocking chapter because it basically tells the story of some mistakes that were made at the CIA in electronic messaging to a field of people, both hard assets of the United States within Iran and various collaborators that exposed in a machine-readable form communications that essentially exposed the whole network. And what it basically says in this shocking chapter is that America's entire human intelligence network inside Iran was rolled up. Because it's not just that the 2005 assessment was so strident. It's in fact were we at some point flying blind, and did something happen recently besides Bob Gates and Mike McConnell and others coming in and applying a different discipline to the management of the National Intelligence Estimate? We know about a defecting general from Iran, but there may be other information. And to hear the President of the United States, as he said the other day, say, I don't have doubts in this intelligence. We know Iran stopped its weapons program, regardless of all the other things Bush said. Bush said that, and he said, I can't go into means and methods. But Bush himself is at least putting himself on the line, is having confidence what was going on. Is it something is dramatically different? And so it does raise the question, again, about Jim Risen's allegations, which were in a period that says, well, at least in the human side of the intelligence side, we lost a lot of that. Apparently some light has been turned on and been brought back. And I want to add this because it's a very, very interesting question about how we came to this NIE, what the implications are, and what some of the other related parts of it, because I have seen no coverage yet of Jim Risen's interesting chapter in this and what may have changed as far as the quality of our intelligence about Iran, but clearly something very dramatic has changed. Flint Leverett, as many of you know, was Elliot Abrams' predecessor on President Bush's National Security Council staff. He was senior director for the Middle East. Yeah, we had hoped to have C-SPAN here, and they were wondering, well, is anyone going to represent the president? I said, well, you know, we do have Elliot Abrams' predecessor from the National Security Council staff, but I wouldn't call Flint an advocate of the president's positions on these things. But nonetheless, Flint is the director of our Geopolitics of Energy initiative here. Of course, he was with the Brookings Institution, and he's just been profiled throughout the major media over the last several months in his expose on Iran's efforts with us in the spring of 2003 to initiate a process and an attempt to put a comprehensive set of issues on the table to try and normalize relations with the United States. And it is very interesting to me the timing of that April-May effort by Iran with the United States, and then of course now the information we now have about the suspension of Iran's nuclear weapons programs in the same year. And I think it talks a lot about the impulses of Iran at that point. Jeffrey Lewis used to be the director of the Managing the Atom Project at Harvard University. He's well known to people with his nuclear work and non-proliferation work at the University of Maryland. He now directs our non-proliferation and nuclear posture initiative here at the New America Foundation, and is really one of the country's leading scholars in thinking about not just nuclear weapons and nuclear stuff, but thinking about non-proliferation regimes, what's real and what's not. So let me ask Jeffrey Lewis to come in and help set the stage a little bit on his own analysis of where we're at, what the implications are, and then we'll go with Flint Leverett, and then we'll open it up. So Jeffrey Lewis.
Well, great. Thanks, Steve. That's an incredibly generous introduction. I must confess that there are all kinds of different ways to go about analyzing intelligence and different approaches in tradecraft. And I'm a little shocked to learn that hanging out and chatting over beers with a friend about what might have happened to Iran's program would turn out to be a successful method. So it's been quite a few days to see this national intelligence estimate released. It seems to me it's an incredibly important piece of information because the progress and status of Iran's nuclear programs and our confidence in our judgments about those, really that is the central set of facts about Iran's program that tells us whether or not we have enough room and time for diplomacy and whether or not we can in place some kind of agreement with Iran that would allow the United States and Iran to coexist peacefully. And if you don't have high confidence in your judgments, or if you are convinced that there are clandestine programs going on, then you really don't have any of that space. In this regard, the most recent NIE is remarkable, and it really says two things that strike me as being incredibly important. And I'm sure you've both seen them in the news, but they bear repeating in specificity. The first is that with high confidence, the intelligence community judges that in fall 2003, Iran halted its nuclear weapons program, which it defined quite precisely as design and weaponization work and covert uranium conversion and enrichment-related activities. The second thing that the NIE states is that the principal way that Iran would enrich enough fissile material to build a nuclear weapon is through its Centrifuge program, and that it would not be able to do so until sometime between 2010 and 2015. with the State Department saying no earlier than 2013, and all of the agencies agreeing it could actually be quite later than 2015. This is quite different in substance and in tone from the 2005 NIE, which I believe was a memo to holders, which means it was really just sort of an updated version of a previous NIE, and I think carried a lot of the poor baggage. The first is that the 2005 NIE indicated that Iran was determined to develop a nuclear weapon. And that is very different than a judgment about actual programs. That's a statement of intent and a judgment that those programs have stopped. And the second is a sort of set of continuity, which is that the 2005 NIE said that Iran could enrich enough fissile material early to mid next decade. What's interesting about that is the fact that that judgment hasn't moved all that much, even though Iran has installed quite a few centrifuges in its facility at Natanz. I just wanted to walk briefly through those two judgments to give you a sense of what we know about the story as it's unfolded in the press and what kind of educated guesses we can make about the nature of the information, and then give you a sense of what I think this means for Iran's relationship with the IAEA and the role that the United States intelligence community can play in supporting engagement with Iran. In terms of this statement that Iran shut down its nuclear programs sometime in the fall of 2003, this has been, to me, the most fascinating of stories. It seems that for some time the United States intelligence community has been convinced that Iran was pursuing a covert nuclear weapons program, largely based on information contained in a laptop computer that was purloined from Iran, some people say through the German intelligence community. Now, the details of this have always been sort of murky because they've only appeared in the press, and a lot of folks, myself included, have wondered about the reliability of the information. We've even taken to calling it the laptop of death. But the laptop of death had sort of three kinds of information in it that were extremely interesting. And this, by the way, is where all the news reports sort of begin to tell this story of the covert program that was shut down. It had information that was sort of erroneously reported as being about nuclear weapons design work, but was actually about modifications one would make to a missile in order to carry a nuclear warhead. And it also had information about clandestine production of uranium feedstock and some information about drilling that may have been related to drilling a test shaft for a nuclear device, although I'm skeptical of the latter. What was so interesting about that information and what led many of us to really have serious doubts about it is how utterly unconnected to reality some of the information seemed. Some of the reports indicated that the engineering view graphs were actually done in PowerPoint, which suggested to me that the program was not terribly sophisticated, and also sort of disturbed me that PowerPoint had sort of managed to weasel its way even into the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, I hope it has the same deleterious effects on their efforts as it does on our own engineering. But there were other things. For example, the space allocated for the nuclear device in this modified missile was really quite small, 0.6 of a meter in diameter, enough space for a warhead weighing about 200 kilograms. And it seemed to most observers that it was quite implausible that Iran could, at any time in the near future, build a device that small. And the early thing that people began to wonder is, well, maybe this is sort of work that's being carried out at a much lower level, that's sort of exploratory in nature, that advocates for missile programs are pursuing. And so there may be this kind of work, but it's not clear how well coordinated it is and the sort of whether or not it's getting kind of high-level attention. Is this just basically a study? Well, what seems to have happened is, in the intervening time, there have been lots and lots of signs that this work got shut down, but most of the news reporting seems to focus on the spring of this year, which actually led to the delay of this particular NIE, which is quite overdue, and the idea that there were intercepts, communications intercepts that revealed that basically senior Iranian officials complaining that their program had been shut down in 2003. And from the looks of the press reporting, it seems to be that this is not just a single intercept, but it's several. Now, it seems to me that what's so interesting about this revelation is not just that there are some guys talking on the phone about how their clandestine bomb program got shut down, but something else that appeared in the way one of the senior officials described the implication of the intelligence. The phrase was that it unlocked stuff, that there were a whole bunch of things that people didn't understand, that started to help piece together. One thing was, I think, if I had to guess, was the information that Steve alluded to that led me to formulate this hypothesis, which was that there was a huge reorganization of Iran's decision-making in the fall of 2003 in response to UN Security Council pressure and in particular efforts by the IAEA to follow up on the revelation of a large number of unreported Iranian activities. As a student of bureaucratic politics, whenever you get a reorganization like this, it seems quite plausible that you would expect, as Steve said, the sort of snipping off of things that are inconvenient or might get in the way. But there are other things which I think are very interesting to note. The period under which this laptop of death work was carried out has been reported in the press as basically 2001 to 2003, which corresponds quite neatly with the cutoff date. And Iran's research on P2 centrifuges, which is probably the most egregious example of Iran not reporting something that it really ought to have, also occurred in 2002 and 2003 and then was cut off. One of the big doubts that we've had about Iran is sort of not believing that they actually stopped the P2 work in 2003. And so without having access to the actual intelligence, I mean, one can, I think, quite plausibly construct a case and can quite plausibly point to a number of factors that suggest that this account is quite reasonable. The second thing that's worth talking about in somewhat briefer terms is this claim that Iran will not be able to enrich enough fissile material for a bomb until sometime in the 2010 and 2015 timeframe. Now, this has gotten a lot of people's attention because Iran has 3,000 centrifuges of an earlier design called the P1 installed in a facility at Natanz, and they are operating those centrifuges, albeit quite slowly. One of the issues that we've noticed is that Iran has been consuming the feedstock for these at about 20% of the rate you would expect, which means basically they're working at about 1/5 of their capacity. And the IAEA has been able to verify that. But what sort of fascinates me is this question of when Iran is going to be able to overcome the challenges associated with those centrifuges. And it's quite possible that the answer to that is never, although it seems that the intelligence community is hedging their bets somewhat on that. The interesting thing here is that the news media reporting, or the media reporting about the intelligence judgment suggests that one of the crucial factors were photographs taken by foreign journalists on a visit to the Natanz facility this spring. Now, in 2005, Iran arranged a visit, and State Department spokesman called it a staged media event, to which, in retrospect, I now respond, more staged media events, please. It's unclear to me what a photograph could have shown that would have triggered this revelation, but we've been kicking around some ideas, and this is still for me quite an open question. One thing is you could actually have looked at the actual centrifuges. A technical colleague of mine suggested one might see abrasions on the centrifuge casings that would suggest previous centrifuges had crashed. They spin basically at supersonic speeds, and so it's not a good thing when they get off balance. But it may also have been the environmental conditions of the facility or the ways that the centrifuge operators were handling them. So, what does all this mean? Well, to me, it's always seemed that Iran faced quite a dilemma. There are basically two problems with Iran's program that caused concern. The first were specific technical violations of Iran's safeguards agreement, as well as other things Iran did that led one to believe that they intended to violate the safeguards agreement further. And those are things that were within the IAEA's purview, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It was within their purview to investigate those. But the second thing was there was also a much broader concern that people in the West and particularly in the United States had about the nature of Iran's programs. And it always seemed to me that it was going to be difficult to resolve these two things together. The IAEA has adopted a work plan in order to encourage Iran to answer questions about its past activities and unreported safeguards violations and whatnot. And what has always struck me about that is it struck me that it would be very difficult for Iran to fully come clean on the technical things that were within the IAEA's, as I say, purview, without also admitting to some things that would actually worsen the sense of general concern that we had. For example, if they had had a clandestine bomb program, even if it was just paper studies, even if it was just a couple of guys in a defense research institute playing around with PowerPoint, owning up to that would be fundamentally difficult for the Iranians. And in particular, you see the converse of that argued in Washington, which is if Iran could address all of these questions, then we might have a false sense of security. This NIE, as far as I can tell, removes that problem. It essentially opens a path for Iran to be able to own up to a variety of activities before 2003 that perhaps they might have been uncomfortable owning up to because it might have handed hawks in the United States a reason for war, and instead creating the possibility that Iran could simply say, well, yes, there were studies, and we really shouldn't have done them. They were done at these institutes. They were done by these people. And you can come, and you can take a look, and you can verify them. And that's something that I've been particularly interested in, which is to say that it seems to me very unlikely at this point that we're going to get Iran to completely suspend or give up its enrichment capabilities. And so the principal task has been devising a credible, effective mechanism in order to verify that Iran's activities are conducted solely for peaceful purposes, what I'm calling an additional protocol plus, a much higher standard of inspection, a much more intrusive way of simply monitoring Iran's activities. And as I say, I think this NIE creates the possibility for that by allowing Iran to say that it's going to continue exercising its right to enrichment, but in light of this special past history, that it will adopt sort of international best practices in regard to safeguarding its programs.
Before you sit down and Flint takes over, could you briefly respond to the notion Patrick Clausen of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy put out yesterday that in his view, Iran may not have preempted its weapons program. It may have just changed the sequencing of what it's doing. It's focusing on the enrichment as part of a kind of a dual-use process to put one element of its research program now in front of the other. Is that a plausible explanation for what's going on?
Well, you know, it's a statement that sounds technical, but is actually quite really about intentions. I mean, at some level, all of this research is dual use. There is only a very small amount of things that are specific to a weapons program. And so one can simply say, well, the clandestine weapons program is embedded in the open system. But from a policymaking perspective, I mean, what we want are clear barriers that allow us to monitor what Iran is doing and to know it's not moving decisively toward a weapon, and in the event that it is, to give us adequate warning to do something about it. And so it seems to me that if Iran were about more than acquiring general capabilities, but really wanted to build a weapon and get away with it and present the United States with a fait accompli, this civilian program is not the optimal way to do it. The optimal way to do it would have been a clandestine program.
But just to be fair to Patrick and to some other colleagues of his, it is plausible for them to say that Iran pursuing a peaceful use enrichment program does give them the knowledge base and whatnot to
it gives them some, much of the knowledge.
I just wanted to be clear,
absolutely.
Very clear on that.
Absolutely. And for me, and this is why I'm such a fan of the idea of an additional protocol plus, is it seems to me keeping Iran fundamentally stupid is probably not something we can do. But what we can do is in place a kind of agreement that structures incentives so that Iran doesn't want to build a nuclear weapon and gives policymakers in the United States warning so that in the event that Iran does build a nuclear weapon or attempt to, we have time to do something about it.
Thank you. Flint Leverett next. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Good question.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I thought I would pick up from Jeffrey's observations and talk about a couple of things. One is what I think is going to happen now in terms of the policy debate in the aftermath of the release of this unclassified version of the NIE, and then talk about what I think is going on and is not going on inside the administration. What happens now? Well, I think you're already seeing a preview of what will play out over the next several weeks, if not months, and that is going to be essentially a competition of dueling intelligence estimates, namely the U.S. intelligence community's judgments offered in the NIE and those judgments developed purportedly by Israel's intelligence community. I think there is going to be a serious effort on the part of the Israeli government, the Israeli national security apparatus, and linked with hardline elements within the administration, within other parts of the American body politic who don't like the message of the NIE. There will be an effort by those actors to discredit it in various ways. And you can already see the arguments beginning to take shape. One of them, I mean, you heard from Steve referring to Ephraim Snay's observations when he believed that this was, a leak, didn't understand that, a unclassified version of the document actually posted on the website. He says these are duplicitous lies. The U.S. and the Israeli intelligence community agree on Iran's nuclear activities. Well, okay, it wasn't duplicitous lies in the sense that no one was leaking. It was a public release of a document. But by the very next day, you heard the Israeli defense minister talking about how the Israeli assessment, they would agree with the United States that Iran suspended some of the military aspects of its nuclear program in 2003, but that U.S. sources had lost contact with what's really going on in Iran, and that Israeli sources, which are superior, say that Iran has already resumed the military aspects of the program. So you're going to see an argument playing out with regard, in effect, to the sourcing of these judgments and which intelligence community actually has a better grasp on what's going on the ground. I think you will also see an argument playing out on whether, even if the U.S. intelligence community is correct, whether that actually matters. That even if some of these military components of Iran's effort, whether it's working on high explosives, whether it's working on weapons design, whether it's working on polonium triggers, or whatever the case may be, that in a sense the headline would be Natanz is the weapons program. It is the ability to enrich. It is the ability to produce usable amounts of weapons-grade fissile material, or at the very least, the knowledge of how to do that, even if Iran has not yet begun to produce usable amounts of weapons-grade fissile material, that is the threshold that should matter in terms of threat assessment, and that threshold is still an imminent danger. I think you're going to see that kind of argument unfolding over the next several weeks and months. And we're going to see, in terms of the political dynamics here in Washington, which argument gets better traction. I mean, right now, the NIE is out, and I think it's had a real impact on public perceptions. I think it's had a real impact on the political debate in Washington. And now we're going to see the pushback come. And to what extent will the pushback be successful? I think that's going to be a very important dynamic to watch over the next several weeks and months. It has definitely become harder for those who would argue that the United States needs to be preparing seriously for the possibility of military action against Iran's nuclear installations. It has become harder for them to make that case, but it is by no means impossible for them to make that case, and I would suggest that they are certainly going to try very hard to make that case in the near future. What's going on inside the administration? Well, I think it's very significant that we now know that the president was informed about the development of the new information that seems to have been so critical in prompting the fundamental redirection of the NIE, that he was informed about this during the summer. Now, personally, I find it incredible that Director of National Intelligence O'Connell or some other senior intelligence official went into the Oval Office, said, "Mr. President, we have developed significant new information about Iran's nuclear program. We are going to need some time to evaluate that, to scrub it, to work through its implications. It is going to delay the release of this NIE, but I'm not going to tell you what it says, Mr. President." I find that just beyond belief. I mean, Senator Biden suggested that if in that situation President Bush did not say, you know, you need to tell me something about what that information says, that he is perhaps the most incompetent, mentally incompetent, lazy person ever to sit in the Oval Office. I just find it incredible that McConnell or someone at a senior level who would be telling the president about this would not, you know, you wouldn't wait for the question from the president, well, what does the information say? You would give some indication. So,
before you go on, do you think that there were reasons? I mean, I'm always fascinated in presidents that try to construct, and their staff who try to construct deniability. Just looking at it without judgment, do you think there was a reason the president, knowing what was being telegraphed, would want to come out and say he was not informed?
oh, sure, I can understand why he'd want to say he didn't know, because then it's you know, perhaps a little bit easier for him to defend statements that he made after he was informed about the nature of the information. But you know, it is just not credible to me that he did not have some meaningful sense of what the substance of this new information was. And I think that's important because it explains why, after the summer, you saw some very important shifts in the president's rhetoric on the Iranian nuclear issue. Through this summer, his standard talking point, literally for years on this subject, had been, it is unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear, or as he says, nuclear weapon. All of a sudden in September, the definition of the problem changes. And remember his famous World War III sentence, everyone focuses on the World War III clause. What really matters is the other clause in that sentence, in which he says we should now be trying to prevent Iran from acquiring the knowledge of how to build a nuclear weapon. That is a significant redefinition of the problem, and I think at least one reason why he redefined the problem in that way was because he knew this information was there. He could anticipate the direction in which this would take the NIE, and if he did not want to look completely absurd in his public rhetoric on this subject, he needed to be altering the formulation. And I think that's what he's been doing over the last couple of months. Now, I think they really underestimated the impact that this NIE would have on public perceptions and the political debate. I think in the end, it did do a lot of damage to their perceived credibility. But I think that they have been trying proactively to manage the impact of this NIE, in part by shifting their rhetorical formulation on the Iranian nuclear problem over the last couple of months. Now, in terms of policy, the administration, both National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley on the day that the NIE was released, and the President himself yesterday at his press conference made clear that there isn't going to be a change in policy, that the NIE vindicates what they've been trying to do, and it affirms their belief that they have absolutely the correct policy and they are going to proceed exactly along those lines. I actually take them at their word on that. I don't think they are anticipating a major change in policy. I think they will continue to try and marshal as much international support as they can in the Security Council, outside the Security Council, to increase pressure on Iran in various ways, to try and muster as much international support as they can for isolating Iran in various ways. I don't think this effort is going to be very successful. I think even before this NIE came out, they were running up against the limits of that strategy. But I think they will continue to pursue it. And I don't think the President plans to change he doesn't plan to change the approach that he has to sort of the stick side of the equation, and he doesn't plan to change the approach that he has to the carrot side of the equation anyway. And here is where I think the really appalling part of this situation is to be found. I mean, everyone is asking questions about, you know, what does this say about the administration's credibility? What did the President know and when did he know it? Which is, you know, never a good question for a White House to have out there making the rounds. But I'll tell you something. If you think that the President was lying to you about the Iranian nuclear issue, where he was really lying to you was at that press conference yesterday when he described American policy. And he told you it was carrots and sticks, put pressure on Iran, but also hold out the prospect for a negotiated solution, and that the administration had put lots of carrots on the table for Iran. They could have this wonderful future, and that the administration had supported efforts to negotiate with Iran since 2003, when the Europeans, the EU3, another acronym that he seems recently to have learned, the EU3 launched their negotiations with the Iranians, and I quote the President, facilitated by the United States. Well, this is historical revisionism, to say the least, if not, you know, bordering on fiction of an extreme sort. The Europeans launched their negotiating effort with Iran in October 2003, first of all because they felt they needed to fill a vacuum that had been created by the United States, which had cut off its own post-9/11 dialogue with Iran over Afghanistan and had refused earlier that year to pick up on an Iranian offer to negotiate a comprehensive resolution of bilateral differences between the U.S. and Iran. And it was in that context that the EU3, on its own, tried to launch a negotiating initiative with Iran in the fall of 2003. I was in Paris on the day in October 2003 when that initiative was announced. I was in the office of a very senior advisor to then French President Jacques Chirac. And I said to this gentleman, I congratulated him on the European initiative, the sort of initial success in getting something started. And then I tried to ask as politely as I could, mindful that I was sitting in the Élysée Palace, I asked as politely as I said, well, but in the end, don't you really need the United States to come into this negotiation over Iran's nuclear activities if it's really going to go somewhere? And he looked at me, somewhat as a teacher might look at a sort of backward pupil in a class, and he said, well, of course, that is the whole point of what we are doing. It is to drag the Bush administration into nuclear negotiations with Iran that it won't go into on its own. Of course that's what we're doing. And they got the Iranians to suspend, and the Iranians maintained that suspension for almost 2 years. And during that time, the Europeans tried repeatedly to drag the administration into these negotiations, and the administration would not go. To say that the United States facilitated these talks between the EU3 and Iran is just an outright and deliberate distortion of the historical record. In the spring of 2005, the administration reluctantly, and in the face, again, of repeated European pleas to do something to support this, the administration agreed that it would modify the U.S. trade ban with Iran to permit the sale of spare parts for civilian airliners, and that the United States would not block Iran's application for accession to the WTO. But it still refused to join negotiations. And so finally, in the summer of 2005, not after Ahmadinejad took office and messed up all of these wonderful diplomatic initiatives that the United States was facilitating, but in fact before Ahmadinejad came to power, the Iranians said, we've suspended for almost 2 years and we have not got squat from the Europeans, and the Americans won't come to the table, and we're not going to sit around forever. And they resumed their nuclear activities in August of 2005. The following year, in 2006, faced with what was an imminent breakdown in international support for pressuring Iran over the nuclear issue, the administration again reluctantly said, okay, we will participate in multilateral nuclear talks with Iran if it resumes the suspension. But the administration then gutted the offer to negotiate that the U.S. and the rest of the P5 and Germany put on the table. When I say gutted, I mean this. In 2005, the Europeans, trying to keep the negotiations going, came up with their own incentives package for nuclear talks with Iran. Spell out for the Iranians, if you come to a negotiated settlement, here are the kinds of benefits that could flow to you. And it included passages on economic cooperation, technological cooperation, but also included this big section on regional security. And the Europeans were prepared to offer all kinds of explicit and implicit security guarantees for the Islamic Republic, recognition of an Iranian regional role, all of this stuff. In 2006, the Bush administration would not sign on to the incentives package until all of that language was taken out. And so, the Bush administration will sign on to an offer of airplane spare parts or not blocking the WTO accession, but the Bush administration will not put an offer on the table that addresses Iran's most fundamental concerns, namely security, the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, and Iran's place in the region. The administration has consistently and to this day refuses to do that. Since 2006, the Iranians, even with Ahmadinejad in office, have tried repeatedly through the Solana channel and through other channels to elicit some indication that if they came to the table, the United States would be prepared to put Iranian security interests on as part of the agenda, and the administration has consistently refused. Now, until that stops, until that deficit in U.S. policy is corrected, there is no possibility for successful diplomacy to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue. And Secretary Rice now has come out within the last few months publicly on a couple of occasions and has said regime change is not U.S. policy toward Iran, and the President of the United States has refused, even though journalists have given him the chance to do so, he has refused to endorse the statements of his own Secretary of State on that matter. Now, until that changes, we are still going to be stuck in a rut. It may be harder for the hardliners to argue that we need to use military force against Iran, but we are not going to have more constructive policy. We are not going to have more effective diplomacy toward Iran until we actually put a negotiating package on the table that addresses things that the Iranian leadership actually cares about. And that is the real lie of what President Bush and Steve Hadley have said over the last 2 days. That they have, since 2003, made this consistent and generous offer to negotiate with Iran. It is not true. The Bush administration has never put on the table an offer to negotiate with Iran that would be at all attractive to the Iranian leadership. Now, that is not serious policy. It is not serious diplomacy. And unfortunately, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. It would require a really fundamental change of course from this administration, and I think the president will be resistant to do it. So I don't expect much by way of constructive improvement in U.S. policy toward Iran. And we'll see if this NIE has a long-term impact, both in reducing the chances that we end up doing something really stupid militarily, and maybe over time moving towards something that might look like a rational policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flint.
Just to add just a one small item of color to Flint's recounting our position when the Europeans began their efforts with Iran, I shouldn't mention his name, but there's a very senior member of the European Commission who was involved in the early discussions. They were trying to get U.S. support for the effort then. And what may be translated for President Bush as support is the following, is that at the time John Bolton, who was then Under Secretary of State for International Security and Arms Control, was tasked with communicating to the Europeans that America would not block what Europe decided to do on its own. That statement was made to a group of Europeans, but when the statement was made, and I've written about it on my blog, he read it very quietly, one time, and quickly, and very few people heard him. He refused to distribute the statement and refused to say it again. And there was this bizarre theater conveying John Bolton's reluctance even at that point. I think Flint's recounting was correct, but it is that which is being potentially construed as American support of the process was promising not to block or actively undermine, although one can play with that. So let's open the floor. There's so many of you who made it on a snow day. I want to give as much. We'll go quickly and very quick answers if we may. Yes, sir.
This is for Flint. You just going to talk from over there?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. One of the, you mentioned at the top the effort to discredit this NIE. One of the lines of that effort has been to attack the people that were involved
Yes.
specifically, personally,
Yeah.
in preparing it.
Tom Finger and Van Diepen.
Well, I was going to
Yeah.
say institutionally, the State Department, sort of INR types.
Yeah.
Could you, two related questions. First, could you say, do you think that it makes a difference who was actually involved in writing that estimate? And second, somewhat related to that, what's your speculation or insight about any sort of back and forth channels between policymaking people in the White House and the people in the intelligence community with respect to, for example, when it should be released and the fact that it was declassified? Right. There's a lot of speculation that Cheney was really opposed to this. It was a preemptive move to sort of want military action.
So just quick
Yeah.
responses.
Yeah, I think it does. I understand, yes, people are now starting to focus on two individuals, Tom Finger, the chairman of the NIC, and Van Diepen, the National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction issues, who played central roles overseeing the process that produced this NIE. Both Van Diepen and Finger have careers at State, Finger in INR, Van Diepen in the Bureau of Nonproliferation Affairs. They both ran afoul of John Bolton. They both felt that intelligence was misused in the run-up to the Iraq War. And they are now being singled out by some conservative critics as basically just being out to use this NIE to get revenge on the administration. It does matter who is involved in the process, because in the end, the only real resistance to politicization of the intelligence process is the individual integrity and backbone of individual intelligence officers. That is something that has been sorely lacking in the intelligence community over the last number of years. People could have stood up over Iraq, and to a large extent they didn't. People could have stood up over Iran before, to a large extent they didn't. Now we seem to have lucked out, and we had people who were prepared to resist those efforts at back channel politicization and tell the story they thought they needed to tell. That's what intelligence officers are supposed to do. That's why the CIA exists as a separate entity apart from various policy-making shops, and that's how the process is supposed to work. Unfortunately, it doesn't a lot of the time.
Yes, sir.
To follow up on that same point on, I'm sorry I'm leaving Jeff out of this, but on the point of the attacks that are going to come at the intelligence agencies and these specific individuals, what is, in your opinion, going to be the effective rejoinder that's going to discount those attacks? Is it going to have to come from McConnell and Gates, somebody at that caliber, or
Okay.
is it?
Response to critics.
Yeah, to some degree, it is going to require people at higher levels, certainly McConnell at a minimum, to defend the integrity of the process and defend the people who were involved. But to some degree, it is also going to depend on a lot of political dynamics that surround this. Having McConnell actually do his job would be helpful, and we'll see if he's up to that.
I want to mention just two quick things that are very important pieces. Mike Isikoff wrote this week that Paul Wolfowitz is going to be invited back to one of the advisory commissions on WMD issues that advises the State Department. And you have people like Bob Joseph, who apparently is also going to be invited to be part of that. And Bob Joseph is on the Defense Policy Review Board. So you're going to see the skirmish go on as well within a number of these advisory bodies, which has a sort of semi-government role, which is going to be a very, very interesting thing. I just wanted to add that to the mix. In the very back, Sandy. Oh, yes, right here.
Question for Jeffrey. You called for additional protocol plus, but what is the Iranian record for implementing the additional protocol that they've already signed? And a question for you, your strategy of grand bargain with Iran is still something you advocate. Wouldn't the administration resist it because it would run counter to their attempts to develop an anti-Iranian coalition with all the Sunni Arabs,
Okay.
Israel, and all the
Thank you.
rest?
Jeff?
Before Iran signed the additional protocol, its record on safeguards was not great. I mean, that's when we had the safeguards violations that came to light in 2002 and got us in the spot where we are now. I think after Iran signed the additional protocol and then began implementing it, the record was pretty good. I mean, what ended that process was Iran's decision that it was going to stop providing basically free goodies, and in order to take a tougher line in negotiations. So, you know, I'm not sure that the past record in that sense is going to be all that reliable of a guide to what happens if we put in place some new mechanism.
Fundamentally, the administration isn't going to go down the road of trying a grand bargain with Iran, because at the end of the day, doing a grand bargain means they're going to need to be prepared to legitimate the Islamic Republic. That's what's going to keep them from doing it, not because they have this strategy going to form a Sunni/Israeli coalition against Iran that's just working so well on the ground. How could they abandon it at this point? It really boils down to a more fundamental point that even if you can get a deal with the current leadership in Tehran that would address our WMD concerns, address our concerns about other problematic issues we have with Iran, this president doesn't want to do a deal that would require him to accept the Islamic Republic. That's the basic problem.
Flint, quick piggyback question on something. Politically, there's a lot of pressure on Hillary Clinton right now because of the IRGC vote that she supported. But what about, is there going to be now political pressure and scrutiny now of Sarkozy and Kirchner, particularly Bernard Kirchner and the French, that more than any other ally have been out there with a kind of World War III saber rattling as well?
I don't know enough about French politics to say. It does strike me that already out of both London and Paris, you are beginning to see manifestations of official displeasure with this NIE, because to some degree it does leave some of our allies who have backed the administration position very strongly. It does kind of leave them out there on a limb, and it's going to be interesting to see how both those administrations cope with that and what the potential political impact might be, both in the UK and in France.
There's some French representation in this room, but I would say that one of the things that really would be an interesting bit of news is to now, given what Sarkozy and President Bush, whether or not President Bush unveiled any of this at all within the content of discussions with Sarkozy here during his recent visit. I don't think so. Mike Gadball.
Can you comment on the reports from Friday that the new Iranian negotiator went on an ideological rant in the discussion with the Europeans, and that this seems to have led the Chinese to soften or to turn around in their position on sanctions? And secondly, how does this debate on the NIE, how is it likely to affect the Senate consideration of the bill to increase sanctions, which in the House version even cancels the license for aircraft parts that the administration and the Congress at least tacitly approved?
Yeah. I think, I mean, I've heard the same kinds of reports that you're alluding to, that at the meeting last week between Jalili and Solana, that Jalili took a line that was, to say the least, unhelpful from Solana's perspective. Ideological rant would fit with some of the descriptions that I've heard. And I think you're right. There were signs that it was having an impact over the weekend in making it probably more likely that China and perhaps Russia would in the end support a third sanctions resolution in the Security Council. But now that you've had the NIE, you know, I think it's going to be very interesting to see over the next few days what that does to the dynamics in New York. I mean, already we have the Chinese perm rep in New York coming out and saying publicly he thinks this is a very important change, and we all, you know, need to reconsider how we should proceed at this point. I doubt if it's going to make it easier for the administration to get some kind of third sanctions resolution adopted.
Jeffrey?
One thing the NIE notes is that we don't have great insight into Iranian decision making, but when I look at the rant, I see bureaucratic aspects. I mean, the position that guy occupies is the same position that was created that I mentioned in the bureaucratic reorganization. Right, that one person with a central authority to make kind of all of those decisions and coordinate all of those parts. And so it could be anything from a new person trying to establish credibility to the sort of recent changeover being a sign that we were actually closer to a deal we thought, and maybe the hardliners have derailed it. But I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that, far from just being impolite, that this probably tells us something important about the internal dynamics in Tehran.
Senate consideration of the sanctions bill?
Sanctions bill?
Yeah, I think it will probably slow down consideration of that measure. I think in the end, the dynamics probably still favor passage of a measure like that. But this could definitely slow down the train a bit.
I mean, and there have to be hearings that now at least put some time in to sort of say what's real and what's not. And on another side of this issue besides China, we also know via Dimitri Simes at the Nixon Center and some others, a little bit about the content of Putin's meeting with the supreme leader in Iran, where Putin was very turned off to Khamenei. It was as Dimitri called it, an application for alliance in which Putin didn't get a word in edgewise over an hour meeting where, Khamenei ranted on about the United States as a satanic force in the world and whatnot. And it was, and when Olmert went to meet Putin immediately after that meeting, I've been told that Olmert was not displeased at all with Putin's profile in this. So to some degree, Iran, despite what we've just learned on the NIE, has actually at some official level, at least at the optics level, harmed its situation with China and Russia rather badly. So that's sort of a counterforce in some of this discussion. But let me, yes ma'am, quickly, if we can just keep it. Yes.
Do you see a role for leadership in Congress and also citizen activists in all of this?
Activists.
And the role of leadership in Congress too.
Role of leadership in Congress.
My general bias, I have to admit, as someone who served in the executive branch for 12 years, is that the less Congress tries to intervene in foreign policy matters, the better off we all are. That being said, I think that the support for dysfunctional U.S. policy toward Iran is longstanding and it's bipartisan. And if there are congressional elements who would be prepared to try and advocate for a more constructive approach, that would be great. I'm very skeptical that Congress really produces that kind of constructive leadership very frequently.
My critique, if I can add, is I am surprised and shocked after the Petraeus and Crocker hearings and some of the things that were rumbling from people like Admiral Fallon. Fallon is very conscious of what was cooking in the NIE and others, that Harry Reid, both as a Democratic leader in the Senate, majority leader in the Senate, and Carl Levin, a distinguished person, hasn't called someone like Fallon towards it for a hearing. I'm interested in the question of why there hasn't been more effort by a democratically controlled Senate to explicate earlier on some of what's coming in the NIE. It's a remarkable thing that there hasn't been more of a pre-positioning, an effort by the Democratic-controlled Congress to allow some of these forces to pre-position their views in the Senate. That is the missing piece of this, which also hasn't been written.
But that assumes that the Democrats collectively really want to be an opposition party on this issue, and I don't believe they do.
The only thing I would add is we should keep in mind that this NIE is a product of congressional legislation, including a requirement that an unclassified summary be made available. So,
yes.
Yes, sir.
Flint, do you believe Iran's exclusion?
Use your lungs so everyone can hear the back.
What is your assessment of Iran's exclusion from the Annapolis conference? Do you think that it might be a tactic by some members of the administration in order to set up different avenues of just addressing some of the concerns that we do have with Iran, like shipping IEDs to Iraq, things like that?
No, I mean, I don't think there was ever any really serious chance that Iran was going to be invited to Annapolis anyway. I mean, there was no constituency in the administration, as far as I can tell, for inviting them to Annapolis. I mean, an important motivator for Annapolis was, the gentleman referred to it a few minutes ago, try and bolster some sense of regional solidarity against Iran. And so in that context, it would just make no sense from the administration's perspective to try and use that as an occasion to reach out to Iran. It's not something they're inclined to do anyway.
That's right. Yes, and then let me go to side side. Yes. We'll hear and then to you, Diane.
Okay. A comparison with North Korean case, the Bush administration made a fundamental change, a policy change about a year ago. And why do you think same thing could happen to Iran's case?
I think that for the neocons and for Vice President Cheney, this is going to sound more flippant than I mean it to, but I think that compared to Iran, North Korea was always something of a sideshow. And I think Cheney, the neocons, are much more dug in to resist a real change in strategic direction on Iran than they were on North Korea. And I think the president himself, has much more reluctance to do something that might require him to accept the Iranian regime than he is to do something which might imply some acceptance of the North Korean regime. I think North Korea is in the end a less ideologically toxic issue for this administration. And I think it's going to be much harder to get that kind of change in policy toward Iran that we've seen toward North Korea.
Let me offer a slight disagreement with Flint. It's very slight, but just a different reading of events. Flint Leverett has done more than anyone else to surface what the May 2003, I guess frankly not calling the Iranians back in May 2003, but also abandoning the process of interaction with Iran in which his wife was very actively involved in trying to basically set up a Bonn conference-like activity for Iraq. We basically slammed the phone down. Within 2 to 3 days after that final interaction with Iran in the first week of May 2003, the six-party talks were given the green light with North Korea. And in my view, and Glenn Kessler and others have written somewhat about this, you had North Korea six-party talks begin and green-lighted in the State Department, and you had the State Department take itself out of Iran. Colin Powell has never said this, but in my view, doing Iran and North Korea was too much for the political establishment to bear. Dick Cheney got the portfolio in Iran. Colin Powell's team got the portfolio in North Korea, and we have very different results on both today. And I think what you see happening is Bob Gates today is stealing the portfolio in Iran from Cheney. Bob Gates is out-Cheneying Cheney. What you saw in the National Intelligence Estimate report, and I don't mean it as a joke, Bob Gates is famous when he was Deputy National Security Advisor for coming into the meetings and basically setting a pace, making sure very clear communications, very clear understandings, making sure that each person was one by one sure of what the policy was, and no one was doing that in the early part. That's the fuzziness, the blurriness around these issues allowed Vice President Cheney's team through the national security bureaucracy to both preempt and stop and also exploit these blurry areas in which there were no consensus. Gates is coming in and basically defining for the president, who's not prone to defining his own views very well, but defining in each and every one of these meetings what the understandings are, what the latitude for action is, and Cheney's cooperation with Mike McConnell and Mike Hayden, the other parts of, because remember, Gates sits on most of the intelligence bureaucracy. It's the end of the dysfunctional relationship between these parties, and Gates' discipline, which is basically robbing the Cheney team of the latitude that they've had before. So this is where I disagree with Flint, and I have some optimism, because I don't believe that Cheney wants to leave the U.S.-Iran engagement at its current terms. No matter what President Bush has said right now, I think it would not be surprising if Bob Gates began to engineer somewhat of a different direction. We'll have to see if it happens. But clearly the momentum right now is with Gates, and clearly the person who's lost momentum in this is Dick Cheney. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I haven't heard much today about Ahmadinejad's threat to destroy Israel and eliminate Israel. Do you think Israel and supporters of Israel in the United States should take much comfort from the NIE estimate, or that the Ahmadinejad is just as determined as ever to carry out his threat?
I don't think that Ahmadinejad has ever been determined to launch some sort of offensive military action against Israel. I mean, he's clearly said things that many of us find offensive. You know, the Holocaust denial rhetoric is just, you know, it's clearly beyond the pale of reality or reasonableness. But that being said, when he has talked in any detail about his position toward Israel, when he talks about Israel disappearing from the map, he talks about basically demographics overpowering, you know, a Jewish population. You move toward a one-state solution rather than a two-state solution, and demographics basically removes any vestige of a specifically Zionist Jewish majority entity in the region. That is his scenario for the disappearance of the state of Israel. It is not a scenario entailing offensive use of nuclear weapons or other types of military force. And, you know, the issue is, too, okay, Ahmadinejad says these things and they're offensive, but, you know, in the end, he is not the most powerful voice in the Iranian leadership by a long shot, certainly not on foreign policy issues. And is there a leadership in Tehran that is prepared to be engaged on the basis of national interest? I believe that there is. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon reoriented, almost 25 years of dysfunctional American policy toward the People's Republic of China. He did this at a time when China was still in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese leadership was still headed by Chairman Mao, when China had tested its first nuclear weapons less than a decade before. And he did that because he made a, I think, correct judgment that there was a leadership in Beijing that was prepared to forge its foreign policy on the basis of national interest. I think there is a leadership in Tehran that is prepared to do that too. And if the United States were prepared to do so, it could engage that leadership in a serious strategic discussion, which would enhance American interests and would also, in the long run, enhance the security of the state of Israel.
I mean, the question that has to be asked about Ahmadinejad that we just put on the table is, given the time of his ascension, if you believe, like I do, that Iran is somewhat of an artificial or fake democracy, it has democratic elements, certainly more than most places in the Middle East, but his rise could have, in fact, if again, go back to the calendar, if the timing is right and Iran made an effort under Khatami to initiate an effort at normalization with the United States, with all issues on the table, if they suspended their covert weapons program in the fall of 2003, if they got nothing in the United States except, bluster, and pugnacious positioning, why aren't we looking at Ahmadinejad as necessarily just another pawn in a move by others? Why he may have, in fact, because it is very interesting to me that, as George Bush said, Iran, and the NIE says, Iran can go back on the weapons track. Why haven't they? Then it makes very interesting what Ahmadinejad's position is. It makes it much more clear he's a part of the optics game, the cosmetic game, but not the substance side of this. It's just remarkable to look at this question, and I think we ought to go back to Khatami's visit here when was it? 06. Khatami came over, and some of us had dinner with him in New York. And now when you go back and you just wonder, you meet the former president of Iran, is he lying? Is he telling the truth? What's the deal? What's he proposing? In my view, Khatami was over here to try to propose to us a way forward. Now, Gareth Porter I saw come in here, and he's got a piece out right now. And with all due respect, Gareth, which is a great piece and people should read it, it's exactly what Khatami was putting on the table at that time, which was, you give us a face-saving way out. Our Iranian street is so committed to the whole concept of an enrichment something along peaceful use that you can package off in a tiny little research project for 20 years. Embed our country with 30,000 inspectors, we'll make it the law of the land. We will prevent any covert weaponization program, and you can search this. Offer that kind of deal, and we can move forward rapidly. This will undermine Ahmadinejad politically. And it was Khatami who told us that within a week of his leaving office, the reprocessing effort had begun. the enrichment process had begun. And so I just want to put that on the table of ask yourself, not just about Ahmadinejad's bluster, but what role is he playing in Iran's chess game with us, given what we know about the calendaring of some of these efforts, frankly, from the past with Flint. Yeah, quickly, Jeff?
Well, I just want to say, we've kind of heard this twice now. The Iranian negotiators were rude to us. Ahmadinejad makes unreasonable statements. I mean, this is a tough business, and you don't bomb people because they hurt your feelings, right? I mean, the fact is, as Steve points out, the NIE indicates that the Iranians, under pressure, shut down the programs. And yes, we should take comfort from that, not just because it means that the clandestine program is in a state of halt, because it shows that the leadership is responsive to pressure. And that, to me, is a huge finding.
Yes. We'll go with the final question here in the back. Is that Ewan?
It is, yeah.
Ewan McConnell from the Guardian.
I'm sorry, I came in late, so you may have covered this already. Is there any indication of why the intelligence was changed? One suggestion yesterday was it was video from foreign journalists in Natanz. Another suggestion was that it was a defector. Another suggestion today because of intercepts of telephone conversations in Tehran.
Man, that was my whole talk.
Yeah, well, we got a lot on that, but I want to just add and then have both Jeffrey and Flint in final comments offer just a quick link. One thing that we put on the table is that I had recommended people to go read the last chapter of Jim Risen's book. I think it's the last chapter that looks at what our state of intelligence inside Iran and the communications, so sort of satellite communications, but the human network inside Iran, what happened to that, and what seems to have happened, because there seems to be a very big difference in types of intelligence that have come in, and I think that Jim Risen chapter is very vital to understanding why the light was switched off, and then begin to speculate on what lights may have been switched on in regard to this. Secondly, Flint, Leverett, and I, in the summer of '06, participated in an Aspen Institute program on Iran. Several people who were close to this Iran intelligence watching activity made a very interesting point. I don't know if Flint remembers it. One of these individuals said that while I guess it's 16 nodes of intelligence, he said there are 5 key nodes of intelligence collection and analysis, and there are efforts within the administration not to have those 5 major nodes meet and to coalesce to come out with an official statement. And I want to ask Flint in relation to this, say, why was that? And he knows who I'm talking about. Why would you not want, at that point, the various engines of the intelligence bureaucracy to basically coalesce around a thing? Is it because they knew they would have to go to war with the Cheney crowd and Bolton and Bob Joseph? Or was it because this person thought that it would be worse than it was? Or that it would divide the administration? Because this was very clearly said that there was an effort not to really change the political currents of the assessment at that time. But so comments about Ewan's comment, but also this Aspen issue. You were there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what the nature of the information was that prompted the reformulation of the NIE. I've seen, all of those kinds of suggestions, and I don't know what it is, but it was obviously something which, when the intelligence community evaluated it, they thought was credible enough and high quality enough that they were prepared to put out this very striking judgment that Iran had suspended its nuclear weapons program in 2003, and to put that out with the highest level of confidence that they use in their rhetorical formulations. So I don't know what the information was, but it's clear the intelligence community is prepared to hang a lot on whatever it was. I didn't really understand that part of the discussion in Aspen. I guess I kind of interpreted it as people not wanting parts of the intelligence community to compare notes because it might actually, in a sense, weaken the case that the administration wanted to make about the bad things that Iran was doing. I didn't interpret it as they're afraid that they'll get such an estimate that's so scary, so alarmist that they'll have no choice but to go to war.
See, I thought it was the other. I thought that they didn't want to do it because it would create a drumbeat to war aspect. But now looking back at it, that could not have been the case.
If this administration did not want a drumbeat war with Iran, wow, that's interesting.
All right, so Jeffrey?
Well, the last thing I would simply say is, when you look at the 2005 NIE, it had this word that Iran was determined to develop. And that just struck me as so interesting because it's a classic Washington, cover your butt, careful statement. And it's about intentions. It can neither really be proved or disproved. And what strikes me as so important about this NIE is the fact that it's actually a description of specific programs and capabilities and the progress that is, or more specifically, isn't being made. And so just the level of specificity at which the judgments are being made suggests to me that this is really something different.
I would also recommend that you go back and read Jeffrey's comment in 2005. It's the latest entry on the blog, or my blog and his blog, where he looked at the reorganization of Iran's national security bureaucracy, or the nuclear bureaucracy at the time, the engagement Iran was having with both Europe and the IAEA, as possibly leading to the covert weapons program being shut down. Jeffrey also makes the interesting insight that he always wondered, given what El-Baradei was trying to pull off with Iran, that if he was going to get a true and accurate accounting of all of Iran's activities, it was going to have to fess up about its past weapons program. And now it can say, of course, it had a past covert weapons program, but it can refer to our own NIE as the evidence that it has shut it down. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank my colleagues, Flint Leverett and Jeffrey Lewis, for joining us. And enjoy the snow. Thank you very much.